The story begins not with gunfire in the streets, but with a silence that carried more weight than violence ever could. Imagine a man who never needed to pull the trigger himself, who rarely raised his voice, yet whose influence stretched across every backroom deal, every shipment of contraband, every whispered betrayal in the dark corners of New York City. This is Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the man known as the Silent General. His was a kind of power that operated in shadows, invisible to the ordinary eye, yet undeniable to those who lived under it. He was not the loudest, nor the most flamboyant, but he was the one whose invisible hand turned chaos into order, transforming a patchwork of feuding gangs into a disciplined, organized criminal empire. The world of crime before Luciano was raw and primitive, ethnic street gangs clawing at each other for scraps, bosses who ruled through brutality but lacked vision. In that chaos, Luciano emerged with something different: foresight. He understood that violence could win battles but not wars. True power was not in blood spilled but in the structures built, the kind of invisible scaffolding that could hold up an empire for generations. To understand Luciano's story is to understand the birth of modern organized crime, and how one man rewrote the rules of the underworld without ever needing to announce himself as its ruler. This documentary takes us on a journey not just through history but through psychology. The psychology of a man who learned early that survival meant adaptation, that loyalty could be manufactured, and that fear could be wielded more effectively than bullets. We will trace his steps from the tenements of New York's Lower East Side to the marble-floored clubs where judges, businessmen, and politicians shook his hand. We will examine the hidden wars he fought, the betrayals he engineered, the empire he built, and the legacy he left behind. The allure of Luciano's story lies not only in the crimes but in the contradictions. He was ruthless yet pragmatic. He was a criminal yet in his own way a reformer. He turned a violent mess into a machine, and that machine outlived him, spreading its blueprint across continents. But behind the myth of Lucky Luciano was a man, ambitious, cunning, vulnerable in ways the public rarely saw. His genius was not in commanding armies of killers, but in knowing when to step back, when to let others believe they were in control, while he quietly pulled the strings. As we move through his rise and fall, one question will haunt us: how much of his legacy is myth and how much is reality? Was Luciano the silent architect of a criminal dynasty that reshaped America, or was he merely the most fortunate survivor of an era defined by bloodshed and betrayal? The truth lies somewhere in the shadows he himself cultivated. And it is in those shadows that this story begins. Before the name Lucky Luciano carried weight in whispers and headlines, the criminal underworld of New York was a tangled, bloody maze of rivalries. At the turn of the 20th century, America's great cities were swelling with waves of immigrants, each community carving out its corner of survival. Poverty, discrimination, and lack of opportunity created breeding grounds for street gangs, secret societies, and extortion rackets. But it was not yet an empire. It was a patchwork of neighborhoods ruled by fear, brute strength, and chaotic ambition. The Mafia of Luciano's youth was not sleek or strategic. It was fragmented, parochial, and vulnerable. Italian immigrants brought with them old traditions of secrecy and survival, sometimes rooted in Sicilian codes of honor and vendetta. In the crowded tenements of New York's Lower East Side, these traditions adapted into something new: rackets that thrived on intimidation, protection schemes, and control of ethnic enclaves. At the same time, Jewish, Irish, and other immigrant groups built their own power structures, creating an atmosphere where violence was daily currency. Each block had its own petty boss, each neighborhood its own petty warlord. And while these gangs controlled corners of the city, they lacked the unity or sophistication to build lasting dominance. The early Mafia in New York was dominated by the so-called Mustache Petes, the old guard Sicilian bosses. Men like Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano ruled with iron fists and old-world values. They believed leadership came from pure bloodlines, Sicilian tradition, and uncompromising violence. Their way was slow to adapt to the modern realities of America's cities. They distrusted outsiders, especially non-Italians, and often relied on personal vendettas instead of broader vision. To them, the Mafia was a family business rooted in heritage, not a corporation that could thrive across cultures. This meant that the underworld before Luciano was defined by chaos. Wars erupted constantly over control of neighborhoods, gambling dens, and protection rackets. Bosses rose and fell quickly, often killed by rivals before they could consolidate true power. The violence spilled into the streets, attracting the attention of police and journalists. What might have remained in the shadows was now visible in headlines about shootouts, stabbings, and mysterious disappearances. The Mafia was feared, but it was also unstable. Its very disorder limited its potential. Meanwhile, Prohibition was about to change everything. The 1920s brought with it a new opportunity for criminals across America: alcohol. When the government banned the sale of liquor, it created a black market larger than any criminal enterprise had ever seen. Smuggling, speakeasies, and bootlegging became the currency of the day, and every gang wanted a piece of the action. But the old bosses were ill-prepared. They clung to their traditions, often unable to cooperate with non-Sicilians, unwilling to see the potential of alliances that crossed ethnic lines. Their parochial mindset meant lost profits and constant wars, while younger men like Luciano were already envisioning something different, something bigger. It is important to understand this landscape because it explains why Luciano's vision was so radical. Before him, the Mafia was fractured, limited by blood feuds, old customs, and short-term thinking. The bosses of that era lacked the ability to see beyond immediate survival. They wanted territory, Luciano wanted infrastructure. They wanted loyalty through fear, Luciano wanted loyalty through profit-sharing. They clung to heritage, Luciano embraced innovation. To appreciate his rise, we must first grasp just how chaotic the underworld was before he imposed order upon it. The world before Luciano was one of shadows without shape, streets ruled by brutal men but lacking a true general. Power was constantly contested, alliances crumbled as quickly as they were formed, and the only law was violence. It was in this crucible of blood and betrayal that a young Luciano studied, learned, and began to imagine a different way. He would take the chaos and mold it into something lasting. Where others saw temporary victories, he saw the possibility of a permanent system. And that is what makes his emergence not just the story of one man, but the story of how the American Mafia transformed from scattered gangs into a national syndicate. He was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, in the small Sicilian town of Lercora, but destiny would reshape both his name and his fate. When his family immigrated to New York in 1906, they joined the swelling tide of Italian immigrants seeking a better life in America. Instead, they found themselves crowded into the suffocating tenements of the Lower East Side, where opportunity was scarce, poverty was constant, and survival was an everyday battle. For young Salvatore, soon to be called Charles and eventually Lucky, this environment was both a crucible and a school. The streets became his classroom, and the lessons he learned there would guide him to power. Life on the Lower East Side was harsh. Families packed into cramped apartments with no plumbing, children worked instead of going to school, and prejudice followed Italians at every corner. For many boys, the gang became an alternative family, a source of belonging and protection. Luciano was no different. From an early age, he showed little interest in conventional success. He quit school after the 5th grade and gravitated to the streets, where gambling, petty theft, and extortion offered both income and respect. It wasn't about rebellion, it was about survival, and in survival he quickly excelled. Luciano wasn't the biggest, nor the strongest, but he had something more valuable: charisma and calculation. He knew when to fight and when to negotiate. He understood the importance of appearances, dressing sharp even when broke, projecting confidence to mask vulnerability. His first hustles were small: running errands for older gang members, helping in protection rackets, and making bets in backroom games, but each one sharpened his instincts. He learned who could be trusted, who couldn't, and how fear could be as useful as friendship. By his teenage years, Luciano was already standing out. He ran dice games, dabbled in drug dealing, and began cultivating a reputation for reliability. But what truly set him apart was his ability to bridge divides. At a time when ethnic lines were rigid and often violent, Luciano didn't hesitate to work with Jewish or Irish kids. It was through this openness that he first connected with Meyer Lansky, a brilliant Jewish teenager with a keen mind for numbers. Their bond, born on the rough streets of Manhattan, would become one of the most enduring partnerships in the history of organized crime. Luciano also crossed paths with Bugsy Siegel, another figure who would become infamous. Together, they represented a new generation of gangsters, one not bound by the old-world prejudices of their elders. But survival came with scars. Luciano was arrested more than once as a young man, facing charges ranging from shoplifting to possession of narcotics. The most famous incident, however, nearly cost him his life. In 1929 he was kidnapped, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on Staten Island by rival gangsters. He survived, barely, and carried the scars on his face for the rest of his life. This incident earned him the nickname Lucky, a moniker that stuck. But it wasn't just physical luck that defined him. His ability to endure pain, to recover, and to learn from it marked him as something different from the average thug. Where others might have been intimidated into retreat, Luciano became more determined, more cunning. Luciano's early hustles weren't just about making money. They were about testing boundaries, building networks, and studying human nature. He saw how older bosses operated, how they demanded loyalty, how they punished betrayal, how they kept power centralized in themselves. But he also saw their flaws. Many were too rigid, too blinded by tradition, too consumed by vendettas to think strategically. Young Lucky took note. He understood that if crime was to thrive in America, it needed to adapt to America's realities. This meant building bridges across ethnic lines, creating systems of cooperation, and treating the underworld like an organization rather than a collection of squabbling gangs. It was in these formative years that the psychology of Luciano began to take shape. He was ambitious, yes, but his ambition was not blind. It was measured, strategic. He knew that one could not win every fight with fists or guns. Sometimes the smarter move was to step back, to wait, to manipulate others into doing the dirty work. He learned to play the long game even as a teenager. Every dice game, every street corner, every handshake was part of a larger education that would serve him when he rose to lead an empire. By the early 1920s, Luciano was already more than a street kid. He was an operator. He had built connections not just with fellow hustlers but with emerging figures in the Italian and Jewish underworlds. He had tasted violence, understood betrayal, and survived near death. And he carried himself with a confidence that others noticed. He wasn't just another boy from the tenements, he was someone people followed, someone who commanded respect. The making of Lucky Luciano was complete. What remained was his transformation into the silent general, the man who would reshape organized crime into something far larger than anyone before him had imagined. Luciano's teenage years had given him the foundation, but it was in his 20s that he entered what might be called the apprenticeship of crime. This was the stage where the streetwise kid transformed into a serious operator, moving beyond petty hustles into the world of organized vice. By the early 1920s, New York was a different city. Prohibition had begun, and the outlawing of alcohol created an ocean of opportunity for those willing to take risks. For men like Luciano, this was the perfect storm. A country thirsty for liquor, a law that guaranteed demand, and criminal networks ready to supply it. He was no longer just the sharp-dressed dice runner from the Lower East Side. He was becoming part of something bigger. Luciano gravitated toward the circles of men who understood that prohibition was the gold rush of their generation. He built connections with bootleggers, smugglers, and corrupt officials who ensured that shipments made their way from Canada and Europe into the hidden bars of Manhattan. These operations required coordination, logistics, and diplomacy, skills Luciano naturally excelled at. Unlike the old bosses, he didn't insist on absolute control. Instead, he acted like a broker, making sure everyone got their cut and smoothing conflicts before they erupted into bloodshed. This made him invaluable. It was during this period that his most important alliances solidified. Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel became not just friends but partners. Lansky, with his mathematical precision and calm demeanor, brought financial discipline and organizational thinking. Siegel, brash and hot-headed, brought muscle and daring. Together with Luciano, they formed a trio that would reshape the criminal landscape. What made their partnership revolutionary was its diversity: Italian, Jewish, and beyond. While the Mustache Petes clung to old-world rules that forbade such partnerships, Luciano saw opportunity. Ethnicity didn't matter. Money did. This willingness to cross lines that others wouldn't dare touch gave him a network that spanned the city and, eventually, the nation. At the same time, Luciano began moving into the dangerous but lucrative narcotics trade. Though heroin and cocaine were less socially acceptable than liquor, they offered immense profits. This move revealed something about Luciano's psychology, his appetite for risk and his ability to calculate danger versus reward. While others hesitated, he stepped forward. This was not recklessness, it was foresight. He saw that prohibition might not last forever, but drugs would always have a market. It was another layer in the portfolio of crime he was quietly assembling. His rise, however, was not without setbacks. Luciano was arrested multiple times during this era, sometimes serving short stints behind bars, other times managing to walk free through bribery or lack of evidence. Each arrest, rather than discouraging him, seemed to teach him. He learned how the courts worked, how police investigations were built, and, most importantly, how politicians and law enforcement could be bought. He began to understand that the real power was not only in the street soldiers who enforced rackets, but in the judges, cops, and politicians who looked the other way. Crime, to Luciano, was not a war against the system, it was a partnership with it. By the mid-1920s, Luciano had come under the orbit of Giuseppe Joe the Boss Mafia, one of the most feared mafia leaders in New York. Mafia ruled with brute force and demanded absolute loyalty, but he lacked the vision Luciano possessed. For Luciano, aligning with Mafia was a strategic move, an apprenticeship that allowed him to observe how the old guard operated, while quietly planning for something more efficient. He became Mafia's lieutenant, trusted but never entirely committed. This position gave him access to the highest circles of mafia life in New York, where he could study the politics, the betrayals, and the methods of leadership up close. But Luciano's true apprenticeship was not only with the Italian bosses. He kept close ties with Lansky's Jewish networks, Siegel's Muscle, and other underworld figures outside Mafia's control. This dual existence, appearing loyal to the old world Don while cultivating a new world alliance, was dangerous but brilliant. He was learning to balance identities, to present one face to tradition and another to the future. In this duplicity lay the seeds of his eventual takeover. Perhaps the most telling trait of Luciano during these years was his patience. While younger men rushed for glory, he played the long game. He knew Mafia would not rule forever. He knew the old ways would not survive in America. He didn't need to overthrow the old order immediately, he only needed to wait, learn, and prepare. His apprenticeship of crime was not about serving a master, but about studying one's weaknesses until the time came to exploit them. And so, through the 1920s, Luciano absorbed every lesson the streets had to teach. He learned diplomacy from Lansky, audacity from Siegel, power politics from Mafia, and the value of vision from observing the failures of the Mustache Petes. He was not yet the silent general, but he was preparing for that role, quietly, invisibly, patiently. Like a chess player moving pawns into place, Luciano was arranging the board. The kings and queens of the old mafia didn't know it, but the game was already shifting. The apprentice was almost ready to become the master. The 1920s roared with jazz, bootleg liquor, and the illusion of endless opportunity, but in the shadows of New York, the decade was soaked in blood. For all the money pouring in from Prohibition, the underworld was in chaos. At its center stood two towering figures of the old mafia world, Giuseppe Joe the Boss Mafia and Salvatore Maranzano. Their rivalry ignited what came to be known as the Castellamarese War, a vicious struggle that left the streets littered with bodies. It was not just a conflict over territory and profits, it was a war for the very soul of organized crime in America. And in this storm of violence, Charles "Lucky" Luciano saw not just danger but opportunity. Mafia was Luciano's patron, his so-called boss. Brutal, greedy, and deeply paranoid, Mafia ran his organization like a despot. Loyalty was demanded, not earned, and disobedience was punished with death. His worldview was old-world Sicilian. Domination through fear, no tolerance for outsiders, and absolute reliance on his inner circle of Sicilian loyalists. For a time, Luciano played the role of loyal lieutenant, but he had already seen the cracks in Mafia's model. The future of organized crime, Luciano believed, required inclusion, cooperation, and corporate-style management, not endless vendettas that bled profits dry. On the other side of the war stood Maranzano, a Sicilian immigrant from Castellammare del Golfo, who brought with him an almost medieval vision of power. He was cunning, well-educated, and steeped in Sicilian traditions. His soldiers saw him as more disciplined than Mafia, more strategic, yet he too clung to the old ways, placing heritage and hierarchy above innovation. His dream was to install himself as the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. The irony was that both men, Mafia and Maranzano, were mirror images of a dying order. They were fighting over who would inherit an outdated model of control, even as the world around them changed. The war between them was ruthless. Gunfights erupted on city streets in broad daylight. Kidnappings and assassinations became so frequent that the newspapers treated them almost as routine. Bootlegging routes were disrupted, gambling dens were destroyed, and trust between families dissolved. Dozens of gangsters died, sometimes in carefully planned hits, other times in chaotic bursts of gunfire that left bystanders running for cover. The bloodshed drew the full attention of police and press, jeopardizing the very profits everyone fought to protect. For men like Luciano who envisioned the mafia as a business, this was insanity. Caught in the middle, Luciano navigated a dangerous tightrope. He maintained his place within Mafia's camp, gaining the boss's trust, while at the same time sending quiet signals to Maranzano that he was open to negotiation. It was a deadly game. Betrayal meant certain death, but Luciano believed survival lay in choosing neither side completely until the time was right. His true loyalty was not to either man, it was to the idea of a new order, one that would replace both bosses. The decisive moment came in 1931. Luciano, Lansky, and their circle realized the war could not continue without destroying everything. The profits of prohibition were too enormous to waste on vendettas. Luciano devised a daring plan: eliminate Masuria, then remove Maranzano, and in the vacuum install a new system. But to accomplish this, he would have to betray the very man who had raised him. On April 15, 1931, Luciano set his plan into motion. He invited Joe Masuria to a lunch at Nuova Villa Tomorrow, a Coney Island restaurant. The meeting seemed ordinary, but behind the scenes, Luciano had arranged everything. Midway through the meal, Luciano excused himself to the restroom. In that moment, gunmen burst into the dining room. They were not strangers. They were Luciano's own allies, including Bugsy Siegel and Albert Anastasia. They opened fire, riddling Masuria with bullets, leaving his body sprawled on the floor, a playing card in his hand. With that single act of betrayal, Luciano ended the reign of Joe the Boss. But the war did not end there. Luciano now threw his support behind Maranzano, who quickly declared himself the new Capo di Tutti Capi. At first it seemed a victory. Maranzano offered Luciano a powerful role in his administration, rewarding him for his betrayal of Masuria. Yet Luciano soon realized Maranzano was no different. He demanded unquestioned loyalty, clung to old-world hierarchies, and obsessed over consolidating power in himself alone. Within months, Luciano discovered that Maranzano had secretly ordered his death, fearing the young lieutenant's ambition. Luciano moved faster. In September 1931, just 5 months after Masuria's murder, Maranzano prepared to meet with Luciano in his office on Park Avenue. But before Luciano could arrive, a team of assassins disguised as government agents stormed the office. They announced themselves as lawmen, ordered Maranzano's guards to stand down, and then turned on the boss. With knives and bullets they cut him down, ending the last of the old world rulers. It was the first recorded use of hitmen masquerading as federal agents, a tactic so bold, it stunned even hardened gangsters. In less than half a year, Luciano had removed both Masuria and Maranzano, the two most powerful mafia bosses in New York. He had not fired a shot himself. He had not staged grand declarations. He had orchestrated everything from behind the curtain, letting others do the killing while he emerged unscathed. This was the birth of Luciano as the silent general, the man who could reorder the underworld with precision and invisibility. The Castellamarese War ended with Maranzano's blood on the floor, but it also marked the beginning of something far greater. The chaos of the old guard had been swept away. In its place, Luciano was ready to build a structure that would outlast vendettas and carry the Mafia into the modern era. Where Masuria and Maranzano fought to become bosses of bosses, Luciano would abolish the very title. He did not want to rule like a king, he wanted to manage like a chairman. And in the ashes of war he finally had the chance. With the blood of Masuria and Maranzano drying on the sidewalks of New York, the underworld stood at a crossroads. For decades, Italian crime in America had been dominated by autocrats, bosses who demanded fealty, enforced loyalty with bullets, and waged wars that drained profits. Luciano had witnessed firsthand the futility of this model. He knew that if organized crime continued down the same path, it would destroy itself. What the Mafia needed was not another Capo di Tutti Capi, another so-called boss of bosses, but a new kind of structure, something more durable, more rational, something that could endure beyond the whims of a single man. Out of this vision came Luciano's masterpiece, the Commission. Luciano's genius was in recognizing that America was not Sicily. The immigrant communities were not isolated villages, and the criminal opportunities were far greater than anything the old world mafiosi had ever known. To control the wealth of prohibition and the rackets that followed, the Mafia could not remain a collection of feuding families locked in endless vendettas. It had to be a corporation. And just as a corporation had a board of directors, Luciano designed a governing body for the underworld that could mediate disputes, coordinate operations, and share profits. No longer would there be one supreme boss whose death or paranoia could plunge the entire system into chaos. Power would be distributed, regulated, and, most importantly, sustainable. The Commission was formed in 1931, in the immediate aftermath of Maranzano's assassination. Luciano invited the leaders of the most powerful families across the United States to participate. At its core were the 5 families of New York, Luciano's own, led under his careful watch, the families of Joe Prophesai, Vincent Mangano, Tommy Gagliano, and Joseph Bonanno. To these he added other influential figures: Al Capone's Chicago outfit, Frank Costello's political machine, and leaders from Cleveland, Buffalo, and beyond. By extending the commission's reach nationally, Luciano ensured that New York would be the hub, but not the dictator, of American organized crime. In its structure, the commission resembled a boardroom more than a gang. Each family had representation. Disputes between families would be settled by the group, not by street violence. Territory would be mapped out, rackets divided, and decisions made collectively. Luciano positioned himself not as a dictator but as a chairman, first among equals but careful never to claim absolute supremacy. This subtlety was deliberate. He understood that flaunting power would only invite rebellion. True authority lay in invisibility, in letting others believe they were partners rather than subjects. The commission also served another function. It ended the dangerous ethnic isolation of the Mafia. While Italians dominated the leadership, Luciano continued to work closely with Jewish figures like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, as well as Irish allies in labor unions and politics. This cross-ethnic collaboration was revolutionary. The old bosses had shunned outsiders, but Luciano embraced them. He saw that money had no nationality, and that partnerships could expand influence far beyond what insular Sicilian traditions would allow. By opening the door to these alliances, Luciano expanded the reach of organized crime into legitimate industries, unions, and even government offices. The creation of the commission was also a psychological victory. It shifted the mentality of mobsters from short-term survival to long-term strategy. No longer would every insult or encroachment spark a war. Now, grievances could be brought before the board, adjudicated with profit in mind rather than pride. Luciano understood human psychology well enough to know that greed was a stronger glue than fear. If everyone had a seat at the table, if everyone shared in the profits, then the impulse to revolt would diminish. Fear was still present, it always would be, but it was no longer the only currency. Critically, Luciano abolished the title of Capo di Tutti Capi. He had seen how the ambition for that role had fueled bloodshed between Masuria and Maranzano. By eliminating the position altogether, he removed the prize that tempted men into constant wars. Instead, the commission became the ultimate authority. Decisions made by the collective were binding, and anyone who defied the commission was marked for death. In this way, Luciano achieved balance. No single man could dominate, yet no single man could defy the system either. The commission's first years proved its effectiveness. Prohibition profits continued to flow smoothly, gambling dens thrived, and the Mafia expanded into new ventures: labor racketeering, loan sharking, and control of construction unions. By mediating disputes, the commission reduced open street warfare, making the Mafia less visible to the public and harder for law enforcement to penetrate. Luciano had succeeded in creating exactly what he intended: an invisible government for organized crime, a shadow corporation that paralleled legitimate business structures. But Luciano's role as architect was not just logistical. It was psychological. He cultivated an image of fairness, of someone who listened before he acted. Other bosses trusted him not because he was the most ruthless, though he could be ruthless when necessary, but because he seemed to put the collective above himself. He played the part of mediator, problem solver, and strategist. This image concealed the deeper truth, that the very system he built ensured his dominance. By sitting at the center of the web, by controlling the flow of information and relationships, Luciano guaranteed that nothing significant happened in organized crime without his knowledge or his approval. The establishment of the commission marked the true turning point in the history of the American Mafia. It was no longer a loose collection of street gangs fighting over scraps. It was a structured, disciplined, national syndicate, modernized, corporatized, and far more dangerous than before. And while outwardly Luciano was just one of many, in reality, he was the architect of it all, the silent general whose invisible hand guided every decision. In building the commission, Luciano achieved something few gangsters ever managed. He created stability. Stability in an enterprise built on crime, corruption, and violence may sound like a paradox, yet it was precisely this paradox that defined his genius. By bringing order to chaos, he secured not just his own power, but the future of organized crime in America. From this point forward, the Mafia was no longer a fleeting menace. It was an institution. The commission was the skeleton of Lucky Luciano's empire, but the blood that flowed through it, the lifeblood of organized crime itself, was something older, something inherited from Sicily. It was not written on paper nor signed in contracts. It was whispered, enforced, and etched into the minds of every man who took the oath. Omerta, the code of silence. This code was not a quaint relic of the old world. It was the psychological mechanism that made Luciano's empire possible. Without it, his carefully designed structure would collapse into betrayal, leaks, and paranoia. With it, the Mafia could operate like an invisible state, stronger than law enforcement and more binding than religion. Omerta was more than silence in the face of the police. It was a total submission of the self to the family. To speak to outsiders was treason, to confess was suicide, to question orders was unthinkable. A man who entered the Mafia was no longer just an individual, he became part of a collective organism. His life, his family, even his death belonged not to himself but to the family. And this loyalty was not kept alive by oaths alone. It was kept alive by fear. Every soldier knew the price of betrayal: the bullet, the knife, the acid. A traitor's body was rarely found whole, if found at all. Omerta was enforced not by law but by terror. Luciano understood the psychology of Omerta better than anyone. Unlike the old bosses who relied solely on brutality, he fused fear with incentives. If a soldier obeyed, he prospered. If he stayed loyal, he ate. Luciano's system rewarded compliance just as much as it punished defiance. This duality was key. The code was not merely a set of prohibitions, it was a psychological contract. It promised money, protection, and belonging in exchange for absolute silence and loyalty. Men who had once been nothing, street kids, immigrants, outcasts, were suddenly part of a brotherhood that gave them identity and status. To betray that was to betray not just a man but an entire way of life. The initiation ritual into the Mafia was designed to ingrain this mentality. A new recruit would have his finger pricked, his blood smeared on a holy card of a saint, the card set on fire in his hand as he swore, "If I betray this oath, may my soul burn like this saint." The symbolism was profound. It fused Catholic ritual with pagan dread, binding men with a sacred terror. For many, this was the only sacrament they had left in the New World. Luciano ensured that this ritual was not a meaningless ceremony but a deeply psychological initiation, a transformation from man into made man. Once sworn in, there was no way out but death. Omerta also created a unique culture of distrust toward outsiders: cops, judges, journalists. In Luciano's world, silence was not just tactical, it was identity. A real man, a man of honor, did not cry to the law, did not complain, did not confess. To talk was weakness. To remain silent was strength. This culture made the Mafia extraordinarily resilient. Prosecutors could break bones, wiretap phones, dangle money or immunity, yet time and again the code held. Police could never understand why witnesses vanished, why juries feared, why men preferred prison to betrayal. They did not realize that for the mafioso, breaking Omerta was worse than death. It was dishonor. Yet the code was not absolute in practice. Luciano himself bent its meaning when useful. He confided in allies like Meyer Lansky, who were not Sicilian, and cultivated relationships with politicians, businessmen, and even law enforcement when it suited him. To Luciano, Omerta was both sacred and flexible. He demanded it from his soldiers, but he was pragmatic enough to blur its edges when expansion required it. This was part of his genius. He maintained the illusion of inviolable tradition while quietly reshaping it to fit modern needs. Fear remained the ultimate enforcer. Stories spread deliberately within the Mafia to remind men of what happened to traitors. A soldier who talked was never just killed, he was made into an example. Sometimes bodies were displayed with grotesque wounds, a message carved into flesh. Other times men simply vanished, their disappearance more haunting than any corpse. This culture of fear was not chaos, it was carefully orchestrated theater. Luciano and his lieutenants understood the psychology of terror. That unpredictability bred obedience. But Omerta was more than a weapon of control, it was also a shield against collapse. The Mafia's enemies were not just cops and prosecutors, they were each other. Rivalries, jealousies, ambitions could have torn the commission apart. What prevented this was the unspoken understanding that loyalty to the family came first, even before personal grievance. A soldier might hate his capo, a capo might distrust the boss, but to break the code was unthinkable. This culture of silence kept the organism alive, even when its parts were at war internally. To outsiders, this made the Mafia seem mystical, almost unbreakable. Journalists romanticized it, politicians feared it, and the public mythologized it. The image of the stone-faced gangster who never talked became iconic, immortalized in films and novels. But beneath the myth lay cold psychology. Omerta worked because it rewired men's identities, merging survival with silence, loyalty with self-preservation. Luciano exploited this perfectly. He gave the code a modern application, no longer just a Sicilian superstition, but a corporate discipline, a rule that made organized crime sustainable on an industrial scale. The paradox of omerta was its double edge. On one hand, it created unity. On the other, it bred paranoia. Every boss feared betrayal. Every soldier feared suspicion. To live in this world was to live constantly under the gaze of the family, where any slip of the tongue could mean death. Luciano himself, for all his control, knew he was never fully safe. Omerta held men together, but it also kept them prisoners. And in this prison of silence, lucky Luciano reigned, not because he was louder, but because he understood how to rule through what was never spoken. The Mafia was never about random street crimes or petty theft. Under Lucky Luciano, it became an empire of industry, an invisible economy that thrived on the shadows of the legitimate world. Where others saw illegality, Luciano saw opportunity. He understood that crime, if organized, could function like any corporate machine, diversified, disciplined, and endlessly profitable. The brilliance of Luciano's leadership was not that he invented rackets, but that he industrialized them. Gambling, smuggling, and unions were no longer scattered hustles. They became the pillars of a national syndicate. Gambling was the Mafia's golden river of cash. For generations, Italians had run neighborhood dice games and card dens, but Luciano scaled it up into a vast operation. Speakeasies during Prohibition became hubs not only for liquor but for betting. Numbers games flourished in immigrant neighborhoods, and the mob taxed every table, every card, every bet. Luciano realized that gambling was not just a vice, it was a necessity. People sought escape, excitement, and the dream of easy money. By supplying that dream, the Mafia tapped into a never-ending demand. Unlike drugs or liquor, gambling never ran dry. It could be reinvented endlessly, from dice to lotteries to racetracks. Smuggling, too, remained central even after Prohibition ended. During the 1920s, liquor had been the blood of the underworld, and Luciano had mastered its distribution networks. When alcohol was legalized, those same smuggling routes did not disappear. They adapted. They carried narcotics from Europe and Asia, stolen goods, even contraband luxuries. Luciano was especially forward-looking in embracing heroin. While many old bosses dismissed narcotics as too dangerous, Luciano recognized the profits were astronomical. He maintained plausible distance, using intermediaries and foreign suppliers, but ensured his family had a hand in the pipeline. In his mind, risk was manageable if the business was properly organized. Drugs were the future, and Luciano intended to control that future. Perhaps Luciano's greatest stroke of genius, however, was his control of unions. To him, labor racketeering was the perfect racket because it straddled legality and illegality. Through unions, the mob could control entire industries without ever firing a gun. Dockworkers, truckers, construction crews. If you wanted materials moved, buildings erected, ships unloaded, you paid the Mafia. Luciano's allies like Frank Costello became experts in manipulating union leaders and siphoning funds. Businesses found it easier to pay off mob-controlled unions than to fight them. And because unions were tied to politics, this gave Luciano leverage over city officials, judges, even mayors. In effect, labor became the mob's Trojan horse inside legitimate society. Together, these industries created a machine that was greater than the sum of its parts. Gambling gave fast cash. Smuggling provided high-risk, high-reward profits. Unions secured long-term stability and political influence. By diversifying, Luciano ensured the Mafia was never dependent on a single racket. If one stream dried up, others kept flowing. He built redundancy into crime the same way corporations build redundancy into supply chains. That foresight was what made his syndicate more enduring than the gangs of the past. But the genius of Luciano's business model was not just in the money, it was in the invisibility. Each layer of the enterprise was distanced from him. Street-level bookies and dockworkers never knew his name. Smuggling crews thought they worked for mid-level bosses. Union leaders believed they were dealing with political allies. Luciano sat far above, invisible, his hand guiding everything but touching nothing. He was not the man at the card table or the dock. He was the man who skimmed from every transaction, the silent shareholder in every racket. This invisibility also shielded him from the law. Prosecutors could arrest a gambler, a smuggler, a union thug, but rarely could they trace the money back to Luciano. His brilliance was in making himself unnecessary to the daily grind while remaining indispensable to the larger structure. He was the CEO of crime, the man who could vanish into society while his machine hummed in the background. The business of crime under Luciano was, at its heart, a study in psychology. He knew men would gamble, drink, smuggle, and steal no matter what the law said. He did not create vice, he monetized it. He turned human weakness into organized profit. And in doing so, he blurred the line between the criminal and the legitimate. His enterprises looked less like gangs and more like industries with payrolls, hierarchies, and revenue streams. This was Luciano's true gift. He made organized crime indistinguishable from the world it fed upon. By the mid-1930s, this machine had made him one of the most powerful men in America, not just in the underworld but in the corridors of power. Politicians looked the other way, businessmen shook his hand, and police officers cashed his envelopes. And all the while, his invisible hand guided the gambling tables, the docks, and the unions, pulling profits from every shadow of the city. All empires, no matter how carefully designed, are fragile. Luciano may have built a corporate structure for crime, but human ambition, greed, fear, jealousy, was always simmering beneath the surface. Allies could become rivals overnight. Enemies could emerge from the shadows of one's own family. In the world of organized crime, stability was always temporary, and Luciano knew it. His brilliance lay in balancing friends and foes, in playing one against the other, in managing the constant churn of loyalty and betrayal that defined the Mafia's ecosystem. The commission, though designed to end bloody wars, was never free from tension. Each boss brought not only power but also ego. Vincent Mangano resented the influence of outsiders like Meyer Lansky. Joe Prophesy guarded his family's rackets with paranoia. Joseph Bonanno, younger and ambitious, quietly dreamed of his own supremacy. In Chicago, the outfit, still powerful after Al Capone's fall, resented New York's dominance. Luciano had to act as both peacemaker and manipulator, ensuring that disputes did not escalate into open conflict. It was a constant balancing act. Reward one ally without alienating another, punish one rival without sparking rebellion. Luciano's closest ally was Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, whose gift for politics made him indispensable. Costello managed relationships with judges, union bosses, and politicians, greasing palms and keeping law enforcement at bay. Together, Luciano and Costello formed a perfect balance of brute force and subtle influence. Yet even within this partnership, tension lingered. Costello's ambition was quieter than Luciano's, but no less real. Luciano had to keep him close, rewarding him with influence while never letting him dominate. Other allies were more volatile. Bugsy Siegel, the hot-headed visionary, was both an asset and a liability. Siegel's charm and brutality helped expand the Mafia's influence into Hollywood and Las Vegas, but his recklessness often threatened stability. Luciano admired Siegel's daring but worried about his unpredictability. Similarly, Meyer Lansky, the brilliant strategist, was trusted like no other, but even Lansky had his limits. He was Jewish, not Italian, and though Luciano respected him as a partner, others on the commission bristled at Lansky's influence. Luciano had to protect Lansky constantly, defending him as indispensable to the syndicate's success. Enemies also lurked within the system. Law enforcement, though often bribed, was not blind. Prosecutors like Thomas Dewey began to rise in New York, determined to expose Luciano's empire. These were enemies of a different kind, incorruptible, relentless, and unwilling to play the game. For the first time, Luciano faced a foe he could not simply bribe or intimidate. Dewey represented a new kind of threat, the legal mind that could untangle his invisible web of rackets. But the most dangerous enemies were often those closest to him. Rival bosses whispered in dark rooms, plotting to outmaneuver Luciano within the commission. Some resented his quiet dominance, the way his hand touched every racket. Others feared his alliances with non-Italians, seeing it as a betrayal of Sicilian tradition. Luciano's strength, his openness to outsiders, was also his vulnerability. For traditionalists, he was too modern, too willing to compromise the old ways. They respected his power but did not fully trust him. Luciano's genius in this period was in his ability to anticipate betrayal before it happened. He used spies within families, cultivated informants, and constantly played factions against one another. If one boss grew too ambitious, Luciano fed opportunities to his rivals. If an ally faltered, he propped them up just enough to keep them loyal. He understood that stability was not about eliminating enemies, it was about managing them, keeping them entangled in a web so complex they could not break free without destroying themselves. The psychology of these relationships was delicate. In the Mafia, loyalty was never absolute, it was transactional. Men stayed loyal as long as loyalty paid. Luciano's task was to ensure that betrayal never seemed worth the risk. He cultivated fear, but he also cultivated dependence. Every boss, every soldier, every ally benefited from the system he created. To oppose him meant jeopardizing one's own profits, one's own survival. This was the invisible leash Luciano kept around their necks. Yet the cracks were beginning to show. The very structure that Luciano had built to prevent wars could not erase human nature. Jealousies deepened, ambitions grew, and whispers of betrayal multiplied. Enemies outside, like Dewey, were pressing harder. Enemies inside, the envious bosses, the reckless allies, were straining the balance. Luciano was still the silent general, but the battles he now faced were not on the streets. They were psychological wars, fought in boardrooms, in smoky backrooms, in whispers and deals. And it was in this shifting landscape of fragile alliances and hidden enemies that the seeds of his downfall were planted. Luciano had built an empire on order, but order in the underworld was always temporary. The next chapter of his life would show just how quickly allies could become enemies, and how even the most carefully crafted empire could unravel under the weight of ambition and betrayal. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano stood at the very peak of his power. His commission had brought order to chaos, his rackets flowed like rivers of gold, and his invisible hand controlled gambling, unions, smuggling, and politics with unmatched precision. On the surface, it seemed that nothing could touch him. Yet beneath that veneer of invincibility, a storm was gathering. Every empire breeds resentment, every invisible kingdom leaves traces, and every untouchable king eventually attracts an enemy who refuses to be bought. For Luciano, that enemy came in the form of Thomas E. Dewey, a prosecutor with ambition as relentless as Luciano's own. Dewey was no ordinary adversary. Unlike politicians and policemen who had bent under Mafia money, Dewey could not be bribed, flattered, or intimidated. His mission was personal: to root out the corruption that had infiltrated New York and to strike at the heart of organized crime. For Luciano, this made him the most dangerous enemy he had ever faced, for Dewey's weapon was not the gun but the courtroom, not bullets but evidence. In a world where silence had always been the Mafia's greatest shield, Dewey was determined to pierce the veil. The opportunity came through one of the most unlikely of rackets: prostitution. Luciano had always distanced himself from the day-to-day operations of vice, yet his empire inevitably touched every shadow of the city. Brothels across New York paid tribute to his lieutenants, ensuring a steady flow of cash. To Luciano it was just another revenue stream, one he barely needed to think about. But to Dewey, it was the crack in the wall, the weak point in an otherwise impenetrable fortress. Prostitutes, madams, and pimps lacked the discipline of hardened mafiosi. They could be pressured, coerced, flipped. Where hardened gangsters stayed silent, the underclass of the vice world could be made to talk. Through relentless raids and interrogations, Dewey's office began to connect threats, payments, collections, patterns of protection. Slowly, the outline of Luciano's invisible empire began to emerge. It was not yet enough to convict, but it was enough to indict. And in 1936, Dewey struck. Luciano was arrested and charged with compulsory prostitution, an accusation that stunned the underworld. For a man who prided himself on being the architect, the strategist far above the street-level grime, it was a humiliating charge. Gambling, unions, narcotics, these were the rackets of kings. Prostitution, to many mobsters, was the racket of the gutter. Yet it was on this charge that Dewey intended to bring down the most powerful gangster in America. The arrest itself was a spectacle. Headlines blared, photographers swarmed, and the image of Luciano, dapper, confident but shackled, burned into the public imagination. The myth of the untouchable Don was cracking. Politicians seized on the moment to show their toughness on crime. Citizens who had whispered about the Mafia's reach now saw its king paraded in chains. For the first time, Luciano's invisibility failed him. He was exposed, no longer the silent general but a man on trial in the court of public opinion. Inside the Mafia, the arrest sent shockwaves. Allies who had once seen Luciano as unassailable began to question his strength. Rivals quietly rejoiced, whispering that perhaps the throne was weakening. Even loyalists wondered how far the case would go. Was this just another temporary inconvenience, or was it the beginning of the end? In a world ruled by perception, the sight of Luciano behind bars was as damaging as any conviction. Power in the Mafia was not only about money or guns, it was about aura. And Luciano's aura of invincibility had been pierced. The betrayal too was bitter. To build his case, Dewey relied on witnesses from Luciano's own world. Madams, pimps, even low-level mob associates who saw cooperation as their only chance at survival. The code of omerta, so fiercely upheld in the Mafia's upper ranks, did not always extend to those on the periphery. Luciano was discovering the vulnerability of his empire, When you control everything, you are connected to everything. And in those connections, even the weakest link could be exploited. Psychologically, the fall was devastating. Luciano had built his identity on being untouchable, on seeing further and acting smarter than his rivals. Now, in the glare of the courtroom, he was forced into the role of defendant, vulnerable before the very system he had once corrupted with ease. The press painted him as both villain and spectacle, the dashing gangster brought low by the law. To the public it was a morality play. To Luciano it was the first act of a slow, humiliating descent. Yet even in this moment of collapse, Luciano's mind was calculating. He did not panic. He did not beg. He knew that trials could be swayed, juries could be influenced, appeals could be bought. He played the role of dignified leader, presenting himself as too important, too sophisticated to be tied to street-level prostitution. But inside he understood the gravity of what was happening. This was not a street war he could win with bullets. This was a war of perception, evidence and testimony, battles fought on terrain he could not fully control. The fall of Lucky Luciano had begun, not with a rival's bullet, but with the voice of women dragged into courtrooms recounting payments, names and orders. It was a fall born not from betrayal at the top, but from exposure at the bottom. And it was proof of the cruel irony of power. The higher one climbs, the more fragile the perch. Luciano had built a criminal empire on the promise of invisibility. But now, under the relentless spotlight of Thomas Dewey, he was more visible than ever before. The courtroom became the new battlefield, and for the first time in his life, Lucky Luciano was fighting on ground he had not chosen. In street wars he thrived, strategy, alliances, bullets in the night. In boardrooms of the commission he reigned, diplomatic, calculating, always one move ahead. But in the cold, austere chamber of a Manhattan courthouse, he was stripped of invisibility, reduced to a man in a suit, facing the relentless machine of the law. This was not a war of soldiers and capos. It was a war of evidence, witnesses, and persuasion. And unlike the underworld, where silence was sacred, the courtroom was a place where silence could kill. Thomas E. Dewey, the young special prosecutor, knew the stakes. Bringing down Luciano was not just a legal victory, it was political theater. Every question he asked, every witness he summoned, was designed not only to prove guilt but to strip away the myth of Luciano's invincibility. He painted Luciano not as the distant strategist he claimed to be, but as the architect of New York's prostitution empire. The irony was brutal. A man who had elevated the Mafia into a corporate-like syndicate was now being dragged down by the most sordid of rackets. Dewey hammered this point relentlessly. The prosecution's case hinged on testimony from prostitutes and madams who had lived under the Mafia's shadow. Women like Cokie Flo Brown, flawed, vulnerable but convincing, stood before the jury and told stories of payments, threats and protection rackets that reached up to Luciano's men. In the rigid hierarchy of the Mafia, these were nobodies. Yet in the courtroom they became weapons. Their words, once whispered in brothels, now echoed under oath, slicing through omerta like knives. Luciano's defense team tried to dismantle these witnesses, painting them as unreliable, addicts and criminals seeking to save themselves by pointing fingers upward. They argued that Luciano, a man of influence and refinement, would never sully himself with such lowly rackets. His attorneys stressed the lack of physical evidence, the absence of direct orders tying him to prostitution. To many observers the case was circumstantial, a chain of testimony stretched thin. But in Dewey's hands circumstantial evidence became a narrative, one that jurors, weary of corruption and crime, were ready to believe. The media turned the trial into a spectacle. Headlines blared with lurid details, painting Luciano as both a ruthless criminal mastermind and a fallen king. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, hungry for every twist of drama. For the public this was more than a trial, it was a morality play, the glamorous gangster brought low by justice. Every photograph of Luciano in the dock, every article dissecting witness testimony, chipped away at the aura of untouchability he had spent years cultivating. Psychologically, the trial was a test not only for Luciano but for the Mafia itself. Would omerta hold under the weight of subpoenas and cross-examinations? Would the soldiers and associates summoned to the stand remain silent, or would they crumble? To Luciano's frustration, cracks appeared. The outer rings of his empire, the pimps, the madams, the street-level operators, lacked the discipline of made men. Their fear of prison outweighed their loyalty to the code. And though none of Luciano's trusted lieutenants broke, the cumulative effect of smaller betrayals was enough. Piece by piece Dewey built his case. The verdict, when it came in June 1936, stunned even the underworld. Luciano was convicted on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The sentence was unprecedented, 30 to 50 years in prison, effectively a life sentence for a man in his late 30s. In one stroke, Dewey had accomplished what no rival, no bullet, no street war had ever managed. He had taken Luciano off the board not by killing him but by locking him away. For Luciano, the moment was a paradox of humiliation and revelation. On one hand, the silent general had been dethroned, his empire seemingly shattered. On the other, his removal proved something extraordinary, that he had truly been the center of it all. The state had not gone after his lieutenants or his rackets, they had gone after him. The man who had insisted on invisibility was now visible in the harshest way possible, marked by the law as the supreme boss of American organized crime. Within the Mafia, the conviction triggered shockwaves. Some bosses celebrated, believing Luciano's fall would loosen his grip on the commission. Others grew nervous, fearing Dewey's next target. The old guard saw it as proof that modern methods could not protect them forever. Younger mobsters wondered if the commission could survive without its architect. For the first time since its creation, the Mafia's great machine felt uncertain, its gears grinding without the steady hand of its designer. Yet even in defeat, Luciano refused to surrender his dignity. He carried himself in the courtroom and afterward with a calm, almost regal composure. He spoke little, avoided dramatics, and projected the image of a man unjustly targeted, a victim of politics rather than crime. To his allies this stoicism was inspiring. To his enemies it was unsettling. Luciano, even in chains, still seemed to radiate power. The trial and sentence marked a turning point not just in Luciano's life, but in the history of organized crime. It proved that the Mafia could be attacked, that even its most brilliant strategists could be toppled. But it also revealed something deeper, that Luciano's ideas, his structure, his commission, had taken on a life of their own. Even as he was led away to prison, his system endured. The man was caged, but the empire he built continued to operate, a testament to the strength of his vision. And so, as the courtroom emptied and the headlines declared victory, a quieter truth lingered. Luciano was down but not finished. The silent general had been sentenced, but his hand still reached from the shadows, guiding the Mafia even from behind bars. Prison was supposed to end Luciano. 30 to 50 years behind bars, the equivalent of a death sentence for a man not yet 40, was designed to erase him from the criminal stage. The authorities imagined a Luciano broken, stripped of influence, forgotten in a cell. But what they underestimated was the depth of the system he had created. The commission, the rackets, the networks of loyalty, these were not fragile structures that crumbled without his touch. They were machines built to endure. And while Luciano's body was locked away in Dannemora prison, his mind and his will remained very much active. From the first day he understood that survival inside meant more than simply serving time. It meant adapting the rules of the outside world to the inside. His name alone carried weight. Guards, inmates, and even prison officials knew who he was. To the average prisoner, Luciano was not just another convict. He was a legend, a man whispered about in headlines, the so-called mastermind of organized crime. That reputation gave him leverage. And leverage in prison was everything. Through bribes, connections, and the careful placement of loyal men in the right jobs, Luciano recreated his empire in miniature. He arranged for privileges, better food, small comforts, access to visitors. He secured communication lines, subtle but effective, that allowed his words to travel beyond the walls. Visitors came not only in the form of family or lawyers but as emissaries, messengers who carried his directives back to the commission. Even letters, coded and disguised, flowed through the prison system like arteries feeding the body. The Mafia on the outside did not collapse in his absence. In fact, it adjusted, evolving in ways that reflected Luciano's foresight. Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and others maneuvered for influence, but the commission still functioned. Decisions were debated, policies enforced, and disputes settled, all with the invisible hand of Luciano still guiding from within. His men would visit, receive instructions, and then return to New York, presenting Luciano's word as law. To his enemies, this persistence was infuriating. The state had locked him away, yet he remained a force in the underworld. The newspapers occasionally hinted at it, reporting rumors that Luciano was still pulling strings. Prosecutors and politicians bristled, realizing that caging him had not silenced him. But to his allies, his continued presence was stabilizing. The commission without him might have splintered into chaos. With him, even in prison, it remained intact. Perhaps the most striking irony was that Luciano's influence grew during World War II. As America entered the conflict, the government suddenly found itself facing a new kind of fear: enemy sabotage. The ports of New York, essential for moving troops and supplies, were vulnerable to German spies and sympathizers. The Navy, desperate for security, turned to an unlikely partner. Through intermediaries, it reached out to the Mafia for help in protecting the docks. And who better to control the waterfront than the man who had built the commission? From his prison cell, Luciano became part of what would later be called Operation Underworld. The Mafia cooperated with federal authorities, ensuring that the docks remained free of sabotage and strikes. Luciano, still officially a convict, became an unofficial partner of the U.S. government. It was a bizarre but practical arrangement. The state that had condemned him now quietly relied on his influence to safeguard national security. For Luciano, this was vindication. The silent general had not only survived incarceration, he had turned it into a stage for relevance. Inside prison, Luciano also had time for reflection. He read more, spoke less, and considered the irony of his situation. In conversations with fellow inmates, he sometimes mused about his youth, his mistakes, and the empire he had built. Yet there was no sign of regret. If anything, prison confirmed to him that his system was unbreakable. Even locked away, he remained central to the underworld. His belief in the commission, in the idea of organized, business-like crime, was validated every time one of his instructions reached the streets and was carried out. Still, prison was no throne. The isolation wore on him. The food, the monotony, the endless clanging of bars, these were daily reminders of what he had lost. His health, never robust, began to suffer. He missed the luxuries of tailored suits, fine restaurants, and the freedom to move where he pleased. He felt in his bones that time was slipping away. Friends on the outside whispered of his decline. Yet Luciano maintained composure, never letting the state see him broken. He carried himself with quiet dignity, the same unshakable calm that had earned him the nickname Lucky. By the early 1940s, whispers of his usefulness began to circulate. Politicians who had built careers on condemning him now found themselves acknowledging, in secret, that he had helped in wartime. Journalists speculated on whether his sentence might be reduced. Rumors reached him that perhaps, just perhaps, the door to freedom was not entirely closed. For Luciano, power behind bars was proof of his philosophy. Violence won you territory, organization kept it. He had built something larger than himself, something that could not be destroyed by walls or guards. His empire functioned without his presence, yet always with his approval. In that sense, prison did not end his reign, it revealed its durability. The silent general, trapped in a fortress of concrete and steel, had found a way to remain undefeated. And as the war dragged on, fate itself seemed to shift. The very government that had sworn to bury him now contemplated what it might owe him. Luciano's exile had begun with humiliation, but in the shadows of prison walls, he was already writing the next chapter of his improbable survival. The end of the war brought victory for the United States, but for Lucky Luciano, it also brought a reckoning. His role in Operation Underworld had given him an unexpected relevance, but it had not erased his conviction. In 1946, under mounting political pressure, the state of New York quietly commuted his sentence on the condition that he be deported. The government could not be seen publicly rewarding a gangster, but behind closed doors, it acknowledged that Luciano had helped protect American ports during wartime. Thus, the deal was struck: freedom in exchange for exile. On February 10, 1946, Luciano was escorted to Ellis Island, where federal officials processed him for deportation. Crowds gathered, reporters scribbled furiously, and flashbulbs lit the air as the once mighty boss, now 50 years old, prepared to leave the country he had shaped more than any other gangster in history. Luciano boarded the SS Laura Keene, bound for Naples, Italy. In that moment, the silent general became an exile, a man without a homeland, stripped of the streets that had made him powerful. Italy welcomed him as both a curiosity and a threat. To the locals, he was a legend returned to his ancestral soil. To the authorities, he was a danger, a symbol of the corruption they feared might seep into post-war recovery. Surveillance teams trailed him, politicians debated him, and police files bulged with his name. Yet despite official scrutiny, Luciano quickly adapted. Naples, with its narrow alleys, black markets, and bustling docks, was fertile ground for someone with his experience. Even in exile, his instincts remained sharp. He forged ties with smugglers, middlemen, and old-world bosses, and soon whispers spread that Luciano had his hands in the booming heroin trade. Whether he orchestrated the international narcotics pipeline or merely tolerated it remains a subject of debate. What is certain is that during his years in Italy, global drug networks began to expand, and his name was often attached to them. Authorities painted him as the linchpin of heroin routes stretching from the poppy fields of Turkey to the streets of New York. But the truth was more complex. Luciano, always cautious, had learned the cost of visibility. He played the role of consultant more than commander, giving advice, facilitating introductions, and letting younger, hungrier men do the dangerous work. Psychologically, exile was a torment. Luciano craved the streets of New York, the clubs in Harlem, the neon glow of Times Square, the familiar pulse of a city that had once been his empire. Naples, for all its history and beauty, felt foreign. He lived in fine apartments, frequented restaurants, and entertained friends, but beneath the surface he carried a gnawing sense of displacement. His power in America had been tangible. Here it was a shadow. The commission still respected him, but distance dulled his influence. Younger bosses, ambitious and ruthless, began shaping the Mafia without him. Luciano, the architect, had become an elder statesman, respected but no longer indispensable. And yet, his reputation never faded. To the public, he remained the quintessential gangster, the one who had built the Mafia into an empire. Journalists hunted him for interviews, authors sought his perspective, and filmmakers whispered about dramatizing his life. Luciano sometimes indulged these attentions, offering glimpses of his philosophy, his justifications, his regrets, or lack thereof. In one interview, he declared that he had only ever wanted to make money and stay alive. It was a simple, brutal creed, and one that defined his existence to the end. By the 1950s, Luciano settled into a strange dual existence, both lionized and isolated, feared and forgotten. He hosted visitors, mafiosi, businessmen, even American celebrities, who came to pay respects. He held court in cafes and apartments, speaking less than he once did, but always commanding attention when he chose to. His health, however, began to betray him. Years of stress, imprisonment and constant scrutiny took their toll. He suffered from heart problems, and doctors warned him that his lifestyle was unsustainable. Still, Luciano carried himself with the same quiet composure, never allowing illness to diminish his presence. His final years carried an air of melancholy, but also of inevitability. He had outlasted his enemies, survived betrayals, prisons, and wars. He had built a machine that outlived him, one that spread beyond New York to touch Havana, Sicily, and beyond. And yet, he was a man in exile, barred from the city that defined him. His victories felt hollow, his empire distant. The silent general had shaped the battlefield, but the spoils were enjoyed by others. On January 26, 1962, Luciano's story reached its end. He collapsed at Naples International Airport after meeting with an American film producer who had promised to tell his life story on the screen. It was almost poetic. The man who had lived his life in shadows, who had shaped history invisibly, was about to see his myth broadcast in bright lights. But fate intervened. Luciano died instantly of a heart attack at the age of 64. His body was eventually returned to New York, where he was buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, not far from the graves of other Mafia legends. Luciano's exile was not a quiet retreat, but a continuation of the contradictions that defined him. He was a man both celebrated and hunted, powerful yet powerless, revered yet alienated from the land he loved. In the end, exile became his final punishment, not bars or bullets but distance. The silent general, who once commanded the streets of New York without raising his voice, died far from his battlefield, a general without an army. And yet, even in death, his influence remained. The structures he built, the commission, the codes of conduct, the businesslike approach to crime, continued to shape the Mafia for decades. Exile may have removed the man, but the machine he created was immortal. Luciano's end was not an erasure but a reminder. True power is not in presence but in legacy. The story of Charles "Lucky" Luciano does not end with his death in Naples, nor with his burial in Queens. In truth, Luciano never really died in the cultural imagination. His physical body was lowered into the earth, but his shadow continued to stretch across continents, across decades, across the very idea of organized crime itself. What makes his legacy so enduring is not just the crimes he committed, nor the power he wielded, but the system he built, the template for the modern Mafia, and by extension for organized criminal syndicates around the world. Luciano's genius was not in brutality, though he could be ruthless. It was not even in charisma, though he inspired loyalty. His genius was in organization. He took the chaos of immigrant street gangs and refashioned it into a corporate structure, one that could survive leaders, adapt to new economies and outlast governments. This, more than any individual act, is what earned him the title, the man who built the American Mafia. The commission was perhaps his greatest invention. Before Luciano, bosses ruled like monarchs, jealously guarding their territory, often destroying one another in endless cycles of vendetta. Luciano replaced that with something revolutionary. A board of directors, a council where disputes could be settled without constant bloodshed. It was not democracy, Luciano himself held the balance of power, but it was governance. And it worked. 4 decades after his imprisonment, the Mafia continued to function, its leadership transitioning from one generation to the next, its businesses expanding into new frontiers, all under the framework he designed. The commission became the invisible parliament of organized crime, copied not only in America but in Italy, Cuba, and beyond. To this day, when scholars of the underworld study the Mafia, they often begin with Luciano's blueprint. His legacy also lies in the diversification of criminal enterprises. Prohibition had made the Mafia rich, but the repeal of the Volstead Act in 1933 threatened to collapse the economy of organized crime. Many mobsters panicked, unsure where profits would come from next. Luciano, however, anticipated this moment. He encouraged his allies to expand into gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, construction, and entertainment. He treated crime as a portfolio, ensuring that no single market collapse could destroy the organization. This vision, of crime as business with multiple revenue streams, was revolutionary. It is why, long after Prohibition ended, the Mafia thrived. It is also why law enforcement found it nearly impossible to dismantle. Every time one racket was targeted, another remained untouched. And yet, Luciano's legacy is not purely organizational. It is psychological. He understood that power was as much about perception as about action. He rarely needed to raise his voice, rarely needed to be seen. Instead, he cultivated an aura of inevitability, that he was always there, always watching, always the final word. His enemies feared him not simply for what he had done, but for what he could do. His allies respected him because he gave them a system that promised stability in a world of chaos. In this way, Luciano exemplified what modern criminologists call invisible leadership. His hand was everywhere but almost never caught. He was the archetype of the boss who rules from the shadows. The contradictions in his legacy are profound. On one hand, he was a criminal who corrupted politics, exploited women, and fueled violence. On the other, he was a reformer within the underworld, ending bloody feuds, creating order where there had been none. To some, he is remembered as a villain, to others as a visionary. These contradictions mirror the contradictions of America itself in the early 20th century, a nation of opportunity and law, but also of corruption and inequality. Luciano rose from poverty in the Lower East Side, an immigrant who used cunning rather than pedigree to carve his place in history. In doing so, he reflected both the promise and the peril of the American dream. Globally, Luciano's influence stretched further than most realize. After his deportation, the connections between Sicilian mafiosi and American families deepened. He acted as a bridge between two worlds, bringing the discipline of American-style organization to the more traditional Sicilian clans. In the years after World War II, as heroin trafficking exploded, his name surfaced again and again in intelligence reports and police files. Whether or not he personally masterminded the trade is still debated, but his network undeniably facilitated it. The French Connection, the global heroin pipeline that dominated mid-20th century drug markets, bore the fingerprints of Luciano's structural ideas: compartmentalization, international alliances, and shared profits. Even beyond the underworld, Luciano left a cultural legacy. Hollywood, television, and literature embraced him as the archetype of the gangster mastermind. Characters modeled on him appeared in films, novels, and later in television series like The Sopranos. The image of the calm, calculating Don who pulls strings from the shadows owes much to Luciano. He was not the wild gunman of the 1920s, nor the flamboyant bootlegger with flashy cars. He was something more enduring, the businessman of crime. In this sense, Luciano helped create not only the real mafia, but also the myth of the mafia. Yet for all his influence, Luciano's story is also one of limits. His exile was proof that even the most powerful man can be displaced. His health declined, his control waned, and his longing for New York was never satisfied. He died far from his empire, a general without an army. This tension, between the myth of omnipotence and the reality of exile, makes his legacy all the more human. He was not immortal. He was a man driven by ambition, undone by the same flaws that undo all men: pride, greed, and the passage of time. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Luciano's legacy is its durability. Decades after his death, the Mafia still operates on principles he established. Even as law enforcement intensified, even as the FBI launched the RICO Act and dismantled crime families piece by piece, the core of Luciano's system remained. His insistence on compartmentalization, his vision of crime as enterprise, his replacement of monarchic bosses with a council. These ideas continued to shape the underworld. In that sense, Luciano achieved something rare in history. He built a system that outlived its creator. But what of morality? To evaluate Luciano purely as a strategist risks romanticizing a man who caused immense suffering. The prostitution racket alone exploited thousands of women, while his labor racketeering bled working-class communities. His heroin networks destroyed lives across continents. His bribery of politicians corroded democracy. To call him a genius is not to excuse him. It is to recognize the duality of human capability, the fact that brilliance can be bent toward darkness as easily as toward light. Luciano reminds us that organization, discipline, and vision are morally neutral tools. It is their application that determines whether they build nations or destroy them. Psychologically, Luciano's life also offers insight into the criminal mind. He was not reckless, not addicted to violence for its own sake. He was pragmatic, rational, calculating. He saw crime not as rebellion but as industry. This mindset, the ability to detach morality from profit, is what allowed him to rise. It is also what makes his story chilling. For Luciano there were no innocents, only opportunities. That kind of thinking, when combined with charisma and intelligence, creates leaders who can reshape entire worlds. In the end, Luciano's legacy can be summarized in contrasts. He was both villain and visionary. He was both feared and admired. He built a machine designed to endure, yet died in exile, unable to enjoy its spoils. His life was a mirror of power itself, intoxicating, corrupting, and fleeting. And like all powerful men, he left behind not just an empire, but a lesson. The lesson is this: true power is rarely loud. It does not always announce itself with gunshots or speeches. Sometimes, true power is silent, invisible, operating in the spaces between words and in the shadows behind men. Luciano understood this better than anyone. He was the silent general, the man who pulled the strings while others danced. His empire rose and fell, but the world he created remains. Even today, whenever we hear stories of shadow governments, criminal syndicates, or unseen hands guiding events, we are, whether we know it or not, hearing echoes of Lucky Luciano. His invisible hand is still there, in history, in culture, in myth. And that may be his greatest legacy of all. Not that he lived, but that he continues to haunt the imagination, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous men are the ones we do not see.